Summer, 1872. Timberline Ridge was burning alive under a sky too cruel to give rain. In a lone cabin at the edge of the pines lived Nora Callahan, a woman who had buried her laughter with her only son, shot down by mistake by the very soldiers sworn to protect settlers. She had nothing left to lose until the mountain forced her to choose again. One desperate afternoon, she dragged a bleeding Cherokee boy from beneath the claws of a half-mad grizzly, and in doing so, started something the Rockies themselves would finish. 3 days later, the ridge that once took everything from her swore to give something back. If a single act of mercy can make enemies into blood kin and turn a grieving mother into legend, stay until the end, because this one will stay with you long after the wind stops howling. Drop a comment. Where are you listening from? Hit subscribe so you never miss what happens when the mountains choose sides. The summer of 1872, Timberline Ridge, Colorado Territory, and the land was dying hard. The sun hung overhead like a white-hot branding iron, hammering the high country until the pines themselves gave up and bled pitch down their trunks. Every creek that used to sing was nothing but cracked mud and bleached stones now. Grasshoppers clicked across the dust like dry bones rattling in a sack. Even the wind tasted of rust. Halfway up the south face, where the timber thinned and the granite took over, stood a single cabin of axe-hewn pine, roof sagging under the weight of 3 lonely winters. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney, the only sign that anything alive still clung to this ridge. Inside lived Nora Callahan. Folks who remembered the Oregon Trail still spoke her name with respect. Best midwife west of the Missouri, they said, hands steady enough to bring a breech baby into the world by lantern light, while the wagons burned Comanche arrows out of the spokes. But that was another lifetime. 3 years ago, right here on Timberline Ridge, her son Seamus, 19, red-haired, quick with a joke and quicker with a rifle, had ridden down this same trail to warn a late wagon train about flash floods. Twilight fooled the cavalry patrol. Some nervous lieutenant saw movement on the skyline, mistook a freckled Irish boy for a raiding ute, and gave the order. 17 Springfield slugs tore the laughter out of Seamus Callahan forever. Nora heard the volley from the porch. She ran until her lungs bled, reached him just as the last light left his eyes. He managed one word before the mountain swallowed it. Ma. Then nothing. The soldiers called it a tragic error. The army sent a letter full of regret and $50 in scrip. She burned the letter, kept the rifle that had belonged to her dead husband, sold the wagon, and walked into the high timber alone. Since then, she had lived like a ghost with chores. She set snares, gathered rose hips and yarrow, traded jerky and poultices with passing prospectors, who learned quickly not to ask questions. Nights, she sat on the porch with Henry across her knees, listening to the wind scrape the ridge like a bow across gut strings. Most nights, the wind carried the echo of that single volley over and over until she could taste powder on her tongue. She spoke to no one. The cabin had no mirror. She didn't need one. Grief had carved its own lines deep enough. By July, the drought had turned mean. Elk were coming down from the parks early, ribs showing like washboards. Bears, black and grizzly both, raided anything that smelled of salt or blood. Twice she'd found fresh claw marks on her corral posts, high as a tall man's head. She started bringing the mule inside at night and kept a lantern burning low so nothing big and hungry would mistake the cabin for easy meat. She told herself she didn't care if something came for her. Part of her even hoped it would. But habit is stronger than despair. Every morning she still checked the snares, still filled the water barrel from the trickle that hadn't quite died, still loaded the Henry out of muscle memory older than sorrow. That afternoon, the heat was a living thing. pressing down until the air itself felt thick enough to chew. Nora stepped off the porch with her snare bag, boots kicking up dust that hung like smoke. The rifle rode easily in the crook of her arm. She followed the dry creek bed where the rabbit runs were, moving quietly the way a woman learns when the world has already taken everything loud from her. She has never seen the boy yet. She never heard the bear. But something in the mountain was already moving, and the ridge had decided it was time Nora Callahan paid attention again. She was bending to check a limp snare when the sound cut through the baked silence. Water, suddenly and violently disturbed, followed by a high, broken cry that no rabbit ever made. Nora straightened, ears straining. Another splash, weaker. Then a single word in a boy's cracking voice, half plea, half scream. She dropped the snare bag and ran. The dry creek bent sharply around a granite outcrop 20 yards downslope. She skidded on loose shale and nearly went over the edge. Below her, the creek had shrunk to a thread of brown water no wider than a man's arm, but something thrashed in it like a hooked trout. A boy, Cherokee, long black hair plastered to his skull with blood and sweat. 12, maybe 13. One bare leg wedged tight between two boulders the drought had exposed. His free foot kicked uselessly, trying to push him clear. The current was nothing, yet the stones held him like iron jaws. 20 yards above the boy, on the lip of the cut bank, stood the reason he screamed. A grizzly the color of dried cinnamon, silver on the shoulders, one ear hanging in ribbons. A fresh bullet furrow ran the length of its left flank, raw meat shining wet. Cavalry work. 45-70, probably fired in panic and only pissing it off. The bear's lips peeled back from yellow scimitars of teeth. The sound that came out was less roar than furnace bellows. It saw the boy. It saw meat that couldn't run. It dropped to all fours and started down the bank, claws scattering stones like grape shot. Nora had maybe 4 heartbeats. She ripped off her wool coat, sweat-soaked, heavy, and flung it hard. The coat sailed, sleeves flapping, and slapped across the bear's face. For one priceless second, the world went dark for the beast. It reared, pawing at the cloth, snarling in blind rage. Nora slid down the cut bank on her backside, boots first, gravel tearing her trousers. She hit the creek bed hard, rolled, and came up beside the boy. His eyes were huge, black, fixed on the thrashing monster above. "Hold still," she barked, voice rough as splintered pine. She jammed both hands into the wedge, seized his ankle above the trapped foot, and pulled. Skin tore. The boy screamed once, high and animal. Rock scraped bone. Blood slicked everything. The coat came off the bear's head. It shook once, like a dog shedding water, and fixed its remaining eye on them. Nora felt the ground tremble as 800 pounds of killing fury launched itself down the slope. She yanked again, desperation giving the strength she'd forgotten she owned. The leg came free with a wet pop. The boy tumbled into her arms, limp as a half-empty grain sack. She spun, threw him over her shoulder, and ran. The bear hit the creek bed behind her with a concussion that knocked dust from the banks. She heard claws rake stone, heard the furnace roar right on her heels. 10 yards to the cabin. 8. 5. She slammed shoulder first into the door, burst inside, and hurled the boy across the puncheon floor. The Grizzly hit the outside wall like a cannonball. Logs shuddered. The top hinge tore free. Nora threw her weight against the door, slid the oak bar home with shaking hands. A half-second later, claws shredded the pine planks, splinters exploding inward like shrapnel. The bear screamed its hate against the door, the sound rattling the tin cups on her shelf. Then another blow, and another. The bar creaked, but held. Nora backed away, chest heaving, blood pouring down her left arm where the bear's claw had opened her from elbow to wrist. The boy lay curled on the floor, sobbing without sound, eyes fixed on the vibrating door. Outside, the Grizzly circled the cabin once, twice, snuffling, testing. Then the heavy body sounds receded into the heat shimmer, leaving only the stink of blood and the ragged breathing of two creatures who should already be dead. Nora sank to her knees, pressed her bleeding arm against her shirt to slow the flow, and looked at the child she had just pulled from the jaws of the mountain. Neither of them knew it yet, but the ridge had only started collecting its debt. The door held, but the silence that followed was worse. Nora tore a strip from her only clean petticoat, bound her arm tight enough to make the world go gray at the edges, then turned to the boy. He lay on his side, breathing in quick, shallow pulls, eyes never leaving the barred door. Blood from his torn ankle soaked the puncheon floor in a dark, spreading rose. She dragged the table closer, lifted him onto it like he weighed nothing. In the lantern's yellow glare, she saw the rest. Raw rings around both ankles, where iron shackles had bitten deep, purple bruises shaped like a man's thumbs on his thin arms. Someone had chained this child like a dog. "Name," she said, voice hoarse. "Tyon," he whispered. "Mission school English, careful and clipped. My father is Raging Cedar. They want Hidden Grove. They took me so he would tell." A shudder ran through him. "The soldiers fought the bear over water. I cut the chain. I ran. They said, 'A white woman by the dry creek heals anyone.' Nora poured whiskey over the ankle gouges, over her own arm, then drank a slug straight from the bottle because the pain was starting to sing. She threaded a needle by candlelight, bit down on a bullet, and began stitching herself first. No time for weakness. Outside, dusk bled into night. The bear did not return, but something else did. First night, a soft scrape of moccasin leather on the porch boards. Gone before she could reach the shutter. Second night, the faint smell of burning cedar and tobacco drifting under the door. Someone was close enough to touch the walls. Third night, she woke from a half-doze to find a single eagle feather laid on the sill outside the window, still wet with dew. A message. They were watching. They knew their boy lived. She worked without rest. Willow bark tea for the fever that came on the second day. Yarrow and honey were packed into the claw wounds. She set the dislocated toes the rocks had crushed, biting back her own scream when the boys went high and thin. Each time he passed out, she whispered the same thing. "Stay with me, Tyon. The mountain ain't done with either of us." By the third dawn, her arm had swollen hot and angry, red streaks crawling toward her heart. She was burning the last of her coffee grounds when the boy finally opened his eyes clearly. "They're coming," he said simply. "My father will come." Nora looked at the door, at the claw marks deep as axe cuts, and felt the weight of what she had done settle on her shoulders like a yoke. She stepped outside into the cold, thin light. Mist clung to the pines like gun smoke. She could feel eyes on her from every shadow between the trunks. She filled her lungs with pine and blood and the smell of coming reckoning, then spoke to the trees the way another woman might speak to God. "I got your boy breathing. Whatever debt you figure I owe, come collect it in daylight." A raven answered from a dead snag, harsh and mocking. She went back inside, slid fresh cartridges into the Henry, and waited. If this story of one woman's choice in the furnace of 1872 is already pulling at something inside you, do me a kindness. Hit that subscribe button. I've got more true frontier tales that'll rattle around in your chest long after the fire burns down. The latch rattled once, soft as a warning. Then hoofbeats, no attempt at silence. 5 riders walking their ponies, straight into the clearing like they owned the mountain itself. 5 riders stepped into the clearing as if the mist itself had birthed them. At their head sat a man tall enough that his shadow swallowed half the porch. Braids thick as ropes, face carved by sun and sorrow, eyes the color of winter water. Raging cedar. The others fanned out behind him, bows unslung, but arrows not yet nocked. They looked at the shredded door, at the blood on the puncheon visible through the open gap, and something fierce and grateful passed across their faces like wind over grass. Raging Cedar swung down. His moccasins made no sound on the hard-packed dirt. He crossed the yard in 5 strides, stopped an arm's length from Nora, and looked past her to the boy on the table. Tayan lifted a shaking hand. The chief's shoulders dropped a fraction, the only crack Nora would ever see in that stone mask. He turned to her. When he spoke, the words came low, deliberate, English shaped by a tongue that had never bowed. You pulled my son from the bear's mouth. Among the Tisalagi, the woman who gives a child back his breath becomes mother to every child in the band. The mountains will know you as kin. Before Nora could answer, bugle brass sliced the morning open, sharp as a saber cut. Down the switchback trail came 40 troopers in dusty blue, guidons snapping, carbines already half raised. Captain Jared Sloan rode point, saber scar livid across his cheek, eyes cold as spent lead. The same eyes that had given the order 3 years ago. The same eyes that had watched Seamus die. Sloan reined in 10 yards out. His gaze flicked from the claw-scarred cabin to the Cherokee ponies, to the boy on the table, then settled on Nora like a brand. Mrs. Callahan. Flat. Official. The voice of a federal paper. That prisoner is U.S. property. Step aside. Rage and grief collided behind Nora's ribs, but she kept her hand steady on the Henry. Raging Cedar's warriors spread into a half-moon. Bows rose. 40 Springfield hammers clicked back in perfect, terrible unison. The clearing held its breath. Then the mountain answered for all of them. A roar rolled out of the timber like artillery, deeper than thunder, closer than judgment. The cinnamon grizzly burst from the pines, half its face shot away, one eye a black socket leaking pus. It had followed the blood trail 3 days on broken bones and pure hate, and now it was here to finish what it started. The first swipe took a cavalry horse across the neck. Arterial spray-painted the dust red. Another soldier flew 10 feet, ribs caved. Horses screamed and bucked, riders fought for control. Cherokee arrows and army bullets filled the air at once. For one impossible heartbeat, every man, red, white, blue coat, and mourner, faced the same enemy. Nora's voice cracked across the chaos like a whip. "Spread, damn you! Don't bunch!" Raging Cedar bellowed in Salagi. His warriors fanned wide, arrows whistling into muscle and gristle. Sloan's troopers formed a ragged firing line, carbines barking. The bear absorbed punishment like a storm takes rain and kept coming. It fixed on Tayan again, the scent that had dragged it through hell. The boy stood frozen in the cabin doorway. Nora saw death coming for another child on this cursed ridge. She stepped into its path, Henry rising, and Captain Jared Sloan, man she had sworn to kill, spurred his terrified horse straight between her and 800 pounds of dying fury. Saber high, voice raw, with something that might have been atonement. The bear met him head on. The horse took the full impact square in the chest. Bone cracked like green pine in a wildfire. Sloan flew over the bear's shoulder and hit the ground hard enough to drive the wind from his lungs. The grizzly staggered, half blinded by pain and blood. But the diversion bought Nora the one clear second she needed. She levered the Henry, thumbed the hammer, and put the last to 44 rimfire slug through the ruined eye and into the brain. The bear rose once more on hind legs, towering, swaying, a dying mountain of muscle and hate, then crashed forward like a felled pine. The earth shook. Dust drifted across its corpse in slow red clouds. Silence fell so complete that Nora heard her own heart hammering against her ribs. Sloane lay on his back 10 feet away, saber gone, one arm bent wrong. Blood ran from his mouth, but his eyes were open and fixed on her. Something passed between them older than words. Recognition, maybe. Or the first honest look either had given the other, since Seamus bled out on this same ridge. Raging Cedar walked forward through the gun smoke, placed a calloused palm on the bear's great head, in salute to a worthy enemy, then turned to the scattered troopers, still trying to quiet their mounts. "Your captain traded his life for my son's," he said, voice carrying across the clearing like a war drum slowed to mourning. "The debt runs both ways now." Sloane coughed blood, managed to sit. "Not dead yet, Chief." His gaze found Nora again. "Call it square, Mrs. Callahan. One boy for another." He didn't wait for an answer. He hauled himself into the saddle of a trembling remount, waved the bugler back, and led what was left of his column down the ridge without another order. No prisoners, no reprisals. The guidon dipped once as they vanished into the pines, and the mountain swallowed them. 3 dawns later, the clearing filled with people Nora had never seen. They came single file down the hidden trail, women with babies tied to cradle boards, old men leaning on ash-wood canes, warriors carrying rolled buffalo robes and iron cookpots. More than 200 souls who had lived in caves and high parks since the removal orders, now walking into daylight because word had spread on raven wings. The ridge had changed sides. Raging Cedar stood at their head. Behind him, 4 young men raised a cedar pole taller than the cabin roof. They carved it smooth, then burned into the wood the shape of a bent peach leaf, the Tsalagi sign for a life pulled back from the spirit world. When the pole was planted firmly, the chief faced Nora on her porch. The crowd went still. "From this day," he said, "Timberline Ridge keeps you the way it keeps its own blood. Any hand raised against Nora Callahan answers to every Tsalagi rifle from here to the Smoky Hills. Our blood mixed in that bear's wounds. We are one people now." Tyon limped forward on a willow crutch, took Nora's scarred right hand in both of his small ones, and pressed it to his cheek. No fear left in his eyes, only the fierce trust of a child who has seen the worst and found it wanting. Years later, freighters and drifters riding the Highline Trail spoke of a hidden valley, where Cherokee and white families worked the same fields, where children, red hair and black braids, raced barefoot together through the sage, where the midwife called Nora could set a bone or pull a breech baby without asking whose flag you saluted. They said if you camped near that cabin on a quiet night, wind moving through the pines carried 2 names spoken soft as prayer. Seamus. Tyon, like the mountain itself was keeping them alive. And carved deep into the weathered cedar marker by the porch, worn smooth by snow and sun, the words still stood. She chose mercy when mercy had no reason left. The mountains themselves remembered. The wind still moves through Timberline Ridge the same way, carrying the smell of pine and distant rain. Some nights it almost sounds like 2 boys laughing, one with red hair, one with black, running ahead of time itself. If this story carved something into you, the way that Grizzly carved the cabin door, drop a word below. What would you have done in Nora's place? Mercy or the rifle first? Appreciate every one of you who rode this trail with me to the end. Stories like these only stay alive when good people carry them forward. I'll be back soon with another one that'll rattle around in your chest just the same. Until then, keep your powder dry and your heart open. See you on the next ridge.